the Desert Sanctuary with Carl and Laura Forehand.
Often when we have doubts about religion, or we want to be contemplative, or simply ask questions, it can feel like we are wandering out into the desert.
We would like to welcome you to our sanctuary, the Desert Sanctuary.
We've tried to pick guests that resonate with our fellow friends and seekers here in the desert.
Our hope is that you will find life for your body, soul, and spirit.
And now, here is our show.
Hi, welcome to the Desert Sanctuary podcast. I'm Laura Forehand. I'm here with Carl Forehand. And really, I'm excited about the guests that we're going to speak to tonight because she is part of an organization that I have familiarized myself with and follow like everything they're doing. So I'm really excited to talk to her. Before we do that, before I read her bio, what would you like to share?
Yeah, just that I think this will come out right before our book is officially released, called Leaning Forward. It's the new book. It's a continuation of Out in the Desert. It's after all these 280 or so stories. Actually, this is number 280 tonight.
Yay.
After these 280 stories, you kind of get a sense after a while that there's a pattern. Some things are working, people are talking about things that work, that are getting them further down the road, that are leading to healing. They talk about trauma a lot. They talk about the things they experienced in religion, and all those things kind of fed into this new book that we're really excited to publish ourselves. We wanted to keep the royalties, maybe make a little money for once, but also we're just happy about the message. And anyway, so yeah, I think that's all I really want. Just every time I try to encourage people to subscribe to YouTube, the number goes down instead of up. So I'm not going to do that anymore. But who are we going to talk to? That's what we're here for.
I'm really excited about this conversation. I think it's going to be really informative and just so rich. We have Janyne McConnaughey, Ph.D. on the podcast today. She is an award-winning author and trauma-informed advocate. She lived with the effects of child sexual abuse from the time she was 3 years old until she entered therapy and began her healing journey at the age of 61. Realizing healing was possible for survivors, she first authored 3 memoirs describing the effects of childhood trauma and the path to healing. Her most recent publication is Trauma in the Pews, The Impact of Trauma on Faith and Spiritual Practices. Janyne's passion is encouraging other survivors of childhood trauma to seek healing. She is currently a distinguished visiting professor at Tabor College. She has a master's in education, neuroscience, and trauma, and has served for 4 years as board member for the Attachment and Trauma Network, or ATN. 2 of those years were as board president. Janyne builds her 40-year career in teacher education and an expertise in early childhood development to help educators, caregivers, and church ministry workers understand and apply trauma-informed practices. Janyne, her husband Scott, and rescue dog Weber live south of Seattle, enjoy spending time with children and grandchildren. Welcome to the podcast, Janyne. We are so glad that you're here. Like I kind of alluded to at the beginning, I follow all things ATN, including the podcast and just the Facebook pages. So thank you for, yeah, I really am. So thank you so much for all the work that you do, because I think it is incredibly, incredibly important.
So Carl and Laura, thank you for having me today. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. And I always love a fangirl for ATN. And that's actually ATN is a big part of my story. And so thank you for your support for ATN.
Yeah, absolutely.
Janyne, we consider it a privilege to hear people's stories. We actually think stories are sacred. And we count it a privilege that you trust us with your story. And our job is to listen and believe you. But so Laura read your bio. Can you fill us in, give us a little more detail into your past, your story, and whatever level you want to do?
So I was a pastor's kid. And so I grew up in the church. My mother was a teacher. My father was a pastor. And whenever I talk about that my story includes sexual abuse, I always want to say my father saved my life. My father was the nurturing one. He was an amazing person. And I start out Trauma in the Pews with this conversation between us. He lived to 100. And we had many, many conversations during the years when we cared for him. And so the abuse was in a daycare that was owned by a church member, and I was 3 years old. And my mother, she probably had trauma of her own, and when the abuse happened to me, she just did not deal with it well. We did not have an attachment relationship, and that's where Attachment and Trauma Network comes in. We did, as I began therapy, I realized, oh my gosh, I never attached to my mother. There was never an attachment, and the trauma layered on top of it. And I began to realize that I was vulnerable because I didn't have an attachment relationship. And then perpetrators know that. They spot the children who are vulnerable. And so I, as I began therapy, and I just want to say I'd been taught 33 years at a Bible college, and I at 2 different Bible colleges, had served in the church my whole life. Always thought I thought my mother had mental health issues and that I had inherited them. And so, and I was sure I had spiritual problems and attributed my inner turmoil to that. And so when I always talked about that there was just a dark cloud that followed me. And when I got into therapy, I realized that I had experienced sexual abuse from the time I was 3 until I was 23. And at that point, I just thought that this is going to keep happening to me. And I tried to drive my car off a cliff. And so, but I didn't die. And that's a whole nother story that I relate in my first book. And then, and I oddly believe that through the teachings in the church that God didn't let me die. And so I just thought I had to just keep living and do the best I could. And so when I got into therapy and I began to realize, I didn't have attachment. I was sexually abused. This continued on, and I literally buried it all subconsciously. If you would have asked me what my childhood story was, I would have given you this, I didn't get along with my mother, but I really didn't have anything bad happen to me as a child, and I had repressed it all. And so when I got into therapy, it just exploded out of me. Mm-hmm. And I lived in parts, and it even though if you study the internal family systems and parts, I had an extreme version of it, which was DID, dissociative identity disorder. And so I was extremely fragmented, and it was an amazing strategy by a child who figures out how to live. So when I published my first book, that whole story is in my first book, Brave. And, but I got connected with the Attachment and Trauma Network because I thought, oh my goodness, someone understands children like me. Someone understands what all of the inexplicable things I did as a child. And so I actually wrote, I said, I want to volunteer. And they said, oh, you write. Well, maybe you will do blogs for us. And so I was connected to the blog lady. And my first blog was shared over 400 times around the world. And that is really the turning point in my life, was in what I do in my life, because I realized that I had important things to say and that my voice was important, and that I understood children from the inside out in ways in ways that many can't, and that I actually had the ability to write it and express it. And so the next year I spoke at their conferences, and then I was asked to be on the board, and then I started making connections all over the world, all over the United States. And it's only been 5 years since I published my first book. And I'm working on the 5th book right now. And so much has, and so it's, I don't think everybody needs to do what I did. I don't even know. I have moments where I'm like, I'm not really sure I should have done that much, right? But it was like I saw the light and I was like, oh my goodness, there wasn't anything wrong with me. I had experienced trauma, and I can tell people that they can heal. And I just exploded onto the scene is what I did. And so it's been quite a journey. And now I'm realizing that I created a life I can't sustain. And so I stepped down from being board president a couple weeks ago, and to focus better on my writing. And so, but that's kind of the story. But mixed into that is so not because of my not because of my parents, and not because of my dad. His theology and everything, it was so balanced, and he was such a kind person. But later on in my young adult years, I got involved in fundamentalist churches, and that is where, layered on top of the religious trauma that was part of my story, then that got layered on top of it. And let me tell you, when I walked into therapy, I was a hot mess. I was just an unbelievable mess. And so I'm very grateful for the healing and a therapist who just never let go of me and just continued to help me even when it was really dark and difficult. So,
yeah. So you said you were abused from like 3 until like somewhere in your 20s. So, and it started out with a daycare kind of situation. Like, how did that progress then through your 20s, if I can ask that question? Yeah. And if I ever ask anything and you're like, I don't want to share that, that's perfectly fine too.
Right. And I pretty much what I want to share, I put in books. And when I put it in a book, then I'm willing to share it. Right. Okay. That means I processed it. it.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
So yes, there are parts of my story that I've not shared. My therapists know, my closest friends know, but I've not shared that. But I'm working on books that I will share it, and then that'll open that up. So, and the interesting thing about it was that it was all in different situations. We moved a lot, but I was so vulnerable.
Yeah.
That it was like I had a target on my back. You know, they could just spot me and knew I was vulnerable. So, and that's a story that I tell in Brave, because all through like 3 years of intensive therapy, you know, I could hear my therapist groan when we knew we had gotten to another incident where I had been victimized. And she would just groan, and I would like, thank you for groaning. This is hard. This is bad, because there were, I had incidents at 3 and at 5 and at 9 and I was gang raped by a group of 3 boys when I was 12, and by a babysitter father when I was 13. And so it just, and I actually my abuse in my young adult years was when I sought help. And I was so vulnerable. And of course, when you're like any child, you don't understand this is happening to you because these people are wrong and they spot you as being vulnerable.
Right.
So when I arrive in therapy, I'm saying, well, it was my fault, you know. And my mother, she would always drag me away. And she actually told me after I'd been, she didn't know that I had been raped as a college, you know, that 63% of the girls who are raped I'm going to say this backwards. Okay. 63% of those who experience childhood abuse are raped as college freshmen.
Wow.
And so they're just still vulnerable. And that's basically what happened to me. But then my mother said, I hope you behaved yourself on the date because you've always been like this since you were a child. Right. And so she was constantly, so I felt like it was my fault for a lot of reasons. I felt like it was my fault. And I lived in the church believing that it was my fault and taking responsibility for things that were absolutely not my fault. And so, so I think that, the idea, and in no situation was it someone that I did not know.
Okay.
Okay. So all of the hype about stranger danger is not where the danger is.
Right.
They were all connected to the church in some way. I knew them all. For the most part, my parents knew them all. Okay.
Wow.
And so, and I, so when I was 10, I was at camp. And I went down to the fireside altar, and I was talking to a camp counselor, and I told about one of my abuse. And she said, you should not talk about people this way. And you are a pastor's daughter, and this is not acceptable. But if you will ask Jesus to come into your heart, you'll be forgiven. And so that was my salvation experience that I built my life on. And
sounds like it was built on a lot of shame.
A lot of shame. So much shame. You know what's really funny about that is I was in therapy and I told my therapist, we were probably a year in. I said, I don't really deal with a lot of shame. I really don't think I have a lot of shame. And
do you think that's because it's just like normalized sometimes, right? It just becomes a part of your day.
Yeah. And she just kind of looked at me, when you say to your client who is literally drowning in shame. I mean, in every session, I am literally drowning in shame and I can't identify it. I don't understand what it is. So I don't know which book, by the time you write 4 books, you guys are getting there, right? You're like, what did I say in this book? I don't know where I said it. I think I said it. Maybe I didn't.
Yeah.
Maybe I deleted it, but I talk about, Kurt Thompson has a really good definition of what shame feels like neurobiologically. And so I talk about that and how that feeling that we're terrified of, that we run away from, that we call anxiety, is a lot of times shame. And so, I mean, I couldn't even put a staple in a paper incorrectly and not have a shame attack. I mean, I was so much shame. And so, it's kind of, I laugh. My therapist and I, we've had conversations since I ended therapy, and she's always wanted to check on me. And when I say, I didn't have much shame, and we just laugh about it now because it's just so ridiculous. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Straighten out my definition if I'm not right. But so guilt is I did something wrong. Shame is I am wrong.
Right. There's something horribly wrong.
The way I understand that happens is when we don't get what we needed from our caregivers primarily. Right. And then there's traumatic events like you suffered also. And in response to that, you didn't get the care you needed from the people that were supposed to care for you. And could I tie 2 things together and say, why your second book or your most recent book is Trauma and the Pews, about religion and so on. How does religion sometimes inhibit that healing that needs to take place or addressing our trauma? See if you can give me like 3 or 4 questions at once.
I can connect that dot. So what happened is I wrote 3 memoirs, and what I wanted to do was to write a book to survivors help them to understand how they've been impacted by religious trauma, by teachings, by, all of the things that all of us that we talk about. And actually in the publishing process, it was switched to a book to ministry. And I fought that because I said, no, my work is with survivors. And then I kind of, at the Attachment and Trauma Network, the reason we got involved in the schools was that we had adoptive parents who understood trauma, but they'd send these kids to school and they would be re-traumatized. And so while in this process, I told the publisher, I said, I think you're right, because I can help the survivors all day long, but when they go to church, they're being re-traumatized. And so I need to explain to ministry leaders, whether they listen or whether they don't, is not it's not my responsibility. But I've done my part in explaining it to them. And then I'm going to go back and help survivors. And one of those things that I talk about in Trauma in the Pews is that our theology is so shaming. And really, I did a seminar for a religious trauma e-conference. And that's where the premise for the book comes from. And I showed how without the foundation that, kids who suffer trauma, they miss all of those foundational building blocks. And then they come to church already feeling worthless. And the church says, you're right. You really are worthless. Yeah. You really are. And they just like, I knew it. I knew it. Yeah. I knew it. I've always known I was worthless. And so they not only now they already had shame because of their childhood experiences, but now their shame is reinforced by the teachings in the church. Our songs, our wretched worm, all of this. I call it worm theology in the book, and that's not my original term, but it's really. And I have a story in Trauma in the Pews about Nathan. It weaves all the way through the book, and the shame that he never had a hope to heal, because I said, I don't know, I see I'm writing a new book, so now I have one more book to get confused about, right? Where did I say that? I don't know where I said that, but I talked about if you break your leg, you're going to go to a doctor, right? And you know that you need a physician to fix your leg. If you have inner turmoil and you go to a church, they're going to call it conviction. Mm-hmm. If you go to a therapist, they're going to say, oh, you have a dysregulated nervous system. Mm-hmm. So let's work on ways for you to work through and process the trauma so that you can begin to regulate your nervous system. Mm-hmm. And so we give the wrong answer to the problem, and no one can heal. And shame is a big part of why your nervous system is dysregulated.
It's really interesting. Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about bypassing also in the church. Robert Augustus Masters, who's a therapist, wrote a book about shadow, but he also wrote a book called Spiritual Bypassing. And I just think we're really good at that. I was a pastor for 20 years, and I just never had time. Plus, it was just not the mode. We don't stop the trains from running and do self-care. We just didn't do that.
We didn't do that.
Yeah.
And I, my 2 chapters in the book that I write directly to ministry leaders. One is about preparation of ministry leaders, and the other one is look within yourself. And I talk about that fact that we're seeing moral failure and catastrophic falling from the pedestal. And because of what you just said, Carl, that the train is running and we need to stay up there and direct the train. We don't have time to go back in the caboose and figure out that something is actually driving us instead of the locomotive. right? Something is taking us in directions that are not healthy. And so, so you're right. And and the same is true with mothers. I just wrote somebody a message today, and I said, you need to go and you need to get some help. I know you don't think you have time. You have children, you work, you do. But if you don't take the time to heal, you're going to be apologizing to your children later on.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I talk with so many women that were like, oh man, I wish I would have healed. I wish I would have done this work sooner, because I would have done so many things differently. And I love that you talk about parenting in your books, and there's several people now, because we were taught horrible things as parents, out of Christian parenting books. Horrible things were taught to us, to ignore our children's needs and to break their spirits and to let them cry it out and all of this. And I was part of that generation that we did that. And so the only thing I can do is to encourage young mothers to heal and to encourage pastors to heal. You need to go heal, or it could turn out really, really badly.
Yeah.
He mentions, I don't know where you mentioned that, but maybe it was on another podcast, or maybe it was when we spoke last. But, he talks about how, like so much money in the church is going toward keeping the train running. But if we could take that money and, move it towards like mental health. And he even said and that means like pastors.
And the pastor first.
Right.
Because I feel like the toddler in charge thing is pretty prevalent, especially among our white male pastors, because, we've been promoted for whatever reason, and we just kind of deem ourselves as God's man, and I fully believe in God's woman and so on too. But, then you get there and the trains are running, and you can't, nor do you have any framework to address it. I'm glad people like you and others now are starting to try to talk to the church about being trauma informed. I imagine it's an uphill battle, right?
Right. I don't know. It was so much easier just to talk to survivors of childhood abuse, right? That was like, I had to develop whole new layers of self-care when I moved in, when trauma in the Pews, and it really caught me off guard. And by last spring, I was like, oh my gosh, I am not in a good place, because religious trauma and trying to speak to the church is so much more difficult than to talk to survivors and to people and to talk to teachers and to talk to. This is so much more difficult. And I think that the problem is that doing business, and I was fascinated when I realized, oh my gosh, because I had written something similar in something about how we're just perpetuating the system. Like we're getting volunteers. I talk about that a lot when it comes to volunteers and service, that we're taking vulnerable people who desperately need to belong and desperately need to be validated, and we're just putting them into service when they're not ready for it, and we're burning them out. And then and when they collapse, then they get judged.
Yeah.
Well, they must have backslidden because they were so involved, and now look at them, they don't want to do anything, right? And so my mind went in about 10 different directions right there. And so if you have a question, guide me back in.
Yeah, I mean, we get it. I mean, we were there for a long time. I came to a point where I call it a dark night. I don't know if it's an exact, that's the right label to put on it. But I got to a point that I talked about in one of my books about where it seemed like all my thoughts were crashing into each other, and everything was coming up at once. It was a beach ball that I kind of tried to keep underwater for 20 years, and it came up, and I couldn't go back to work and squelch it, or I couldn't just get busy again and squelch it, but I had to deal with it, or I was going to leave everything.
When I finally opened, it was like a whack-a-mole, right? I didn't have enough hands and to beat down everything that was trying to surface because I had kept it so suppressed. And you started talking about spiritual bypass, and that was where I got kind of distracted and went off in about 10 different directions.
That's good.
And people don't realize they're spiritually bypassing. They don't realize that that's what they're doing.
What are some ways they do that? How do they do that?
They say the things that make them feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if you can say a scripture verse and it helps you feel more comfortable, then you don't really have to deal with the underlying issue.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you have a platitude, you can say, if you have a meme, you can post, if you have a prayer mantra, if you have and so in my next book, I talk about the fact that what we're really dealing with are dysregulated nervous systems. And that from the time we are children, and we are constantly, our bodies, polyvagal theory is it's such a fascinating study, and I don't want to go into that, but really our body is constantly searching for ways to regulate. Mm-hmm. And that's where addictions come from. That is where overzealous religious activity comes from. It is where, so much, because we're looking for ways to regulate our body. And many people come to the church because they're looking for a way to regulate their body. And they think that salvation is the ticket for that. And they have this euphoric moment, mm-hmm. and then the euphoria wears off, and you realize I'm no different than I was before. And then you believe that it's because you have a spiritual problem, and it's not that. It's that salvation does not regulate your nervous system. Mm-hmm. And so, and the church, I realized, and this kind of goes into my next book. I realized that when I walked into therapy, my mother said that she had a nervous disorder. That was about the limit of what I understood about the nervous system, right? Yeah. And we don't even know. The church says you're wonderfully made. We don't want to talk about what that means. That you have a survival brain. So much we don't even understand about the bodies that we walk around saying God created.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and it was really, and once again, it was ATN. If I had not found ATN, of course, I was listening to every free podcast or webinar or anything. I even asked for a scholarship to Bessel van der Kolk. So, I would ask for scholarships. I would do, and I was like a sponge for 3 years. Where
the body keeps the score.
Yes, the body keeps the score, and I realized how little I taught psychology. Introductory psychology courses at colleges. I taught ed psych. I had my transcripts are filled with psychology. And nobody ever taught me that my body was trying to regulate. I know that I had zero self-regulation skills.
What were some things that helped you? Obviously, talk therapy can have some benefits, but what else really helped you?
So my therapy that I had was EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And my therapist, she was 72 when she began working with me, and she had practiced for like 30 plus years, and she was skilled, and she was wise, and she was caring, and she, and it was, I did intensive EMDR therapy for 3 years in order to be able to go and do what I do. And that what EMDR, people always say, what's that? And what it's bilateral stimulation that it's based on. And so even when you're walking, I walked miles and miles and miles, then I hurt my back and it's been really hard not to be able to walk. But it's when you are activating one side of the brain and the other, and then back and forth and back and forth. So there's a lot of, with my friend who lives in England, she was watching tennis and I'm like, oh my gosh, watching tennis is bilateral stimulation because your eyes are moving from one side to the other. And she goes, I'm having an EMDR session watching tennis. I mean, we were laughing. You get really nerdy when you start studying this stuff, And so, anyway, what it does is it takes the memory that's never been processed and it brings it, and it allows your brain to reprocess that memory in current time. So, people say, is it like hypnosis? No, you always know, but the bilateral, what my therapist used was the hand tapping. So my hands would be on my knees and she would tap and then go back and forth on my hands. But what it does is it allows you to get down into the limbic brain where the emotional memories are stored, and to bring those up and literally, when it says the renewing of the mind, okay.
Yeah.
Like, we intellectualize that. And that's not what needs to be renewed. What needs to be renewed is your emotions down in your limbic brain. And so that's what I would have sessions. Probably one of the most dramatic sessions was when I got to the memory of my mother pulling me out of crowds all the time and shaming me, and the part of the memory that I could never remember was that she said, if you keep trying to get attention, you're going to be hurt again. And in that moment, I realized that she actually, even though she was really not a good mother, and shamed me and did so much damage, that she actually was trying to protect me. Mm. And it's like a card deck shifting in your head, like that you all of a sudden you have a different perspective. And I talk about that in for meditation, that EMDR is a type of meditation practice because it gives you a different perspective. And so I actually dedicated my first book to my mother. And when I did that, I said, because she never was able to get the healing that she needed in order to ever know me. Mm. And so, but when I did that, my husband goes, what? And my therapist said, what? And I said, what? But because I understood that even though she got it completely wrong, what she was trying to do was protect me.
Yeah.
And that's the power of EMDR, is to get down into those memories and see them from a different perspective, from an adult perspective instead of a child perspective. So
one of the early things we used, and I did it by accident, by reading a book and because someone said you should do some shadow work and gave me a book, and I read it cover to cover. And just tried because I was desperate. It was that time I was talking about. But can I read you a quote and think about this? You may have heard it before. Eugene Janyne said, what is split off or not felt remains the same. When it is felt, it changes. Most people don't know this. They think that by not permitting the feeling of their negative ways, they make themselves good. On the contrary, that keeps these negatives static, the same from year to year. A few moments of feeling it in your body allows it to change. If there is in you something bad or sick or unsound, let it inwardly be and breathe. That's the only way it can evolve and change into the form it needs. What do you think about that?
Beautiful quote. I love that quote. And my therapist said, because talk therapy, the problem with talk therapy, and that talk therapy is a part of every therapy, right? A therapist can use many different modalities, but one of the problems with repeating your story, like I grew up in the church where they would have the testimony meetings and the person would stand up and repeat the same horrible things they did in their life, like a record every time. And what you do is every time you repeat your story, it digs a deeper rut in your brain because you tell it the exact same way. And so my therapist said, no, I hear their story, but it doesn't do any good for them to tell it again because they're going to tell it the exact same way they did the first time. They have to have it reframed so that they can see the story differently. Mm-hmm. And so people who, I hear all the time people say, I've been in therapy for 10 years and I just keep going over the same stuff again and again. I'm like, oh my gosh, no, don't do that. Don't do that. This is your rut in your brain is so deep. There's nobody getting out of that rut. Right. And so you have to there's brain spotting, there's havening, which is an interesting therapy. And there are so many, the ATN directory website, they list an entire list of all of the trauma-based therapies that are used, and there's more and more all the time because we're understanding it better. One of the effects of my trauma is that I'm really bad at trivia, and nobody wants to be on their team, and I can't remember facts, and so if put on the spot, I know nothing. Absolutely. So I'm like, Janyne, your whole field is trauma. You can't name more than 3 therapies. That's
one that when ATN had their movies that matter, it was the very last one, and they did the EFT, the tapping.
Yes.
I thought that was so fascinating. And I used to be kind of scared of that. Like when I don't know, let's say 3-4 years ago, I saw that and I was just like, that just seems odd to me to, just be tapping in certain, what are they called, meridians or something like that. But, I actually, after doing that, Movies That Matter, and having that discussion, I actually went on YouTube and found, some ones for if you have anxiety or whatever. And I was telling Carl, I'm like, that really
works.
It really, I don't know what it is, but I think part of it is that you're actually speaking your truth, instead of just trying to shove it down.
Right. Or giving the narrative that you've always said about it. Right. You finally get underneath and are honest about it.
Yeah. Because even in that movie, and I wish for the life of me, I can't think of the name. I know it had the word ghost in it, but anyway.
Wrestling Ghosts.
There you go. Wrestling Ghosts. Really great movie. But even when she was doing the tapping, her therapist was telling her this seems pointless. Why am I doing, kind of thing, just being really real. And then going and, also, so it kind of sounds to me a little bit like EMDR, where maybe it's working both sides by tapping, because you're symmetrically tapping those meridians, so I don't know. So interesting though.
It's so fascinating. And I think, we were going to talk about, people ask me, what is healing?
Yeah.
What is healing? And I say it's not a magic wand. I don't know if you've ever heard of sand tray therapy or sand play therapy. And it's a really interesting one. But my friend is a child therapist, and I go use, when I'm in Colorado, I go use her sand tray. But you have objects, all sorts of miniature objects, and you just go, and whatever leads you, you get it and you put it in. And I put a church in, and I put a fairy godmother next to it. And my friend who was just doing her work in her office looked at it and was like, that's an interesting one. And she said, and I said, yeah, because the church makes healing sound like a magic wand. That you just need to pray over it. You need to, and I said, and healing is so much work, and it's so physical, and because you hold the trauma in your body.
Yeah.
You don't, the trauma is not held in your brain, it's held in your body. So when I really realized that was, so when my suicide attempt, when I tried to drive my car off, I stopped the car, but then I got out and I ran to the edge of a cliff, and a man stopped and talked me off of the cliff is what he did. But when he convinced me to come back, I turned and I slid face first off the edge and grabbed a tree root. And so my hands hurt my whole entire life. I mean, I went to doctors. They could never figure out and if they can't figure out what's wrong with you, it's probably trauma. Okay. I'm just saying. Right. Mm-hmm. And so, when I finally started healing, nobody wanted to do pedicure or manicures. Nobody wanted to, because my hands were so tight. And slowly, as I began to heal, my hands loosened up, and I did massage with them and everything, because the trauma is in the body. The trauma is in the body. And so when we talk about what is healing, it is processing and processing trauma and moving the trauma out of your body, right? So that your nervous system can begin to be regulated. So you end out, healing to me is that you end out with tools that you can use, and you recognize when you're dysregulated, and you know what to do about it. You know, I have weighted blankets. I have Marna, who's she's always at the conferences, and her weighted shawl. I have a weighted shawl that she gave me, and I feel bad because I'm not naming her company right now. But anyway, but I have fidgets that I use. I have havening that I can do. I have a whole breathing techniques, and that's what I'm putting in my next book. Is I'm putting all of these ways that you can regulate your nervous system and have them as part of your spiritual practices, because coming to making friends with my body and finding ways to help my body and becoming, that to me was the most amazing spiritual experience. Does it look churchy? No. You know, does it? And where do I have to use those techniques more than anywhere else? When I go to anything that's a ministry related, anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I have to take my entire toolbox with me.
Well, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to say, so is there, you talk about trauma, so much of it, if not all of it, is like in our nervous system. So is there a brain body connection? So as a teacher, that's something I really want to know about when I go into the classroom. So when we talk about like our kiddos that have these maybe violent outbursts or, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, all those type of reactions, is there some sort of, like, I can understand there's trauma and, their nervous systems are dysregulated, but is there a brain body connection there as well?
So I'm really glad you asked that question, because I focus so much on the body that I forget to make that connection sometimes. And so what happens is that it's your brain mechanisms that alert you to danger. So yeah. Your amygdala is, I realized like they loved me on a self-study team, because I was always watching. Like I would go observe in a school. I could see everything. When I observed teachers, I could see everything. It was like a super skill, because my amygdala was always on watch for danger. And so when and it doesn't matter if like a child, it could be a smell. It could be the way you move your hand. Okay. It could be absolutely anything. You're not causing danger in the classroom, but all it takes is something that reminds the amygdala of something bad that happened. And they will immediately send an alert to the brainstem. There's no past your prefrontal, your prefrontal cortex goes offline, right? And they just react. They cannot. And there's a great podcast for the ATN where they talk about, John Balin talks about the pause. I don't know if you listened to that one, but
I've listened to all of them.
Yeah. So I'm putting that one in my book because we have to find the pause. We have to realize that. But what happens is that the brainstem floods the body with stress.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's what the dysregulation is. That's what we feel in our body. That's what shame is. Okay.
Okay.
And so when I say we feel it in our body, well, does it just no, we feel it in our body because something has triggered all of those stress hormones to download it.
Gotcha.
So
that makes so much sense.
Even after healing, the triggers still happen, right? I mean, what we usually say is the difference is you learn to respond instead of react.
Right.
And the big thing is the pause.
Pause, right? There's a little part of your brain that really works on helping you to pause, right? It connects the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate. And so if you can, but kids, they have to learn some self-regulation skills to even find the pause. Right. Right. To be able
as adults, right?
Right. So I think that we put, oh my goodness, we put such expectations onto children. And the thing is that the amygdala cannot tell the difference between something that is happening right now and something that happened 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
So when that thing gets triggered, it feels like it is happening right now in this instant, because that's how we survive. We remember when we were in danger before, and our brain tells us, oh, that was dangerous. So you need to pay attention right here. And so, and what we have to do is to help each other ground, co-regulation, help each other get grounded so you can say, oh my gosh, I realized that what wasn't even happening right now. It was something that happened at home or before, or, and so, and that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of work. But if we, one of the things that we want is for children to grow up understanding their nervous systems, like, for them to understand, oh, I feel dysregulated right now. Right.
Yeah.
Oh, I understand my body just got flooded by stress hormones. Right. I mean, if we could teach our young people that, so that it wouldn't just be a mystery to them. Right. It's like our bodies are the great mystery, and we don't know how they work, and we don't know how to help them. Yeah.
That's what Laura said to me the other day. She said, you seem to be a little dysregulated right now.
See how much I'm learning from ATN.
Okay, so you and my husband could probably have a conversation. So the truth is, and he gives me permission to say this, but we both come from severe trauma backgrounds, and we've been married for 44 years, and we have had to learn this together, right? And then we have had to learn that I'm not responsible for your trigger. You're responsible for your trigger, and I'm responsible for my trigger. We've
had those discussions too.
We have.
So
this is a question that doesn't need an answer. So why does my pastor respond to stress like a 5-year-old? The answer is everything we just talked about. Right? Everything
we just talked about.
Yeah.
So a lot of times when somebody's dysregulated, I will say to them, without trying to be a therapist and not poke into things, I have to be pretty comfortable with the person to do this. But I say, how old are you feeling right now? And they will inevitably tell me an age. Oh yeah, I feel like I'm 9, or I feel like I'm 10. And I'm like, well, what what made that feeling start? And they'll say, oh, this is how I felt when my dad threw the, whatever at me, that's, and so our brain will take us right there if we ask the question,
That's so interesting that you said that, because there have been times in our marriage where, I have told him that something will happen, and I'll be like, I just feel like this 5-year-old girl again, like, and not in a fun, like, 5-year-old girl skipping through the fields. I mean, like, I'm feeling very much, like I'm being talked down to, or I'm make myself small or whatever. So it's so interesting that you said that, and I think that's so true. What an interesting thing, how old are you feeling right now? Because I've told him that so many times, like, I'm just tired of feeling like that 5-year-old girl who's, like having to make herself small and getting in trouble and nothing's good enough or whatever, so very interesting.
Yeah. And Christy, you need to be careful what you say to your husband. How old are you feeling right now? That came over really well.
Yeah. No, luckily we didn't know that.
Self-reflection question.
That's right.
Maybe not in an argument you're going to say, so how old are you right now? That's
really good marriage advice, Janyne. Really good marriage advice.
Can you suggest something to people? Okay, I don't want to just keep picking on the church, but I've heard people in church say, I've been in church all my life and I've never seen trauma. And I'm like, you just shake your head and you go, wait, what? But also, in our individual lives, we can have that blindness and we're blaming it on something else. Part of it's our religion, part of it's our experiences and so on. But what's a good way for someone to just start?
It was
like getting in touch with the body, or just whatever helps to ease us into that, at least.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's all right.
I was asked a question after the conference I spoke at, and somebody said, so what's religious trauma? And the way that I approach it, because trauma, like, what harms one person, the other person just walks right by. Okay. And it has to do with your it's all subjective, right? So what I say is that anything that overwhelms your nervous system and you are unable to cope, and and it affects you, not just for that moment. We can all be in situations where we're unable to cope, but an hour later we're okay. Okay. So anything that overwhelms your nervous system and creates an ongoing impact of not being able to cope, and also makes you believe things about yourself that are either untrue or unhealthy, so it is not, the trauma is not, they want to say the event. I've never seen trauma. Well, that means they haven't seen an event that they would call trauma. Mm-hmm. But if you say, have you ever felt totally incapacitated in a church situation and felt like you needed to leave the building, or all of those kinds of things, and a lot more people will say, oh, well, yeah, I felt that, but that's not trauma.
That's the devil. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And there's that. Yeah. There's that. The problem is outside of me and not what I'm feeling inside. And so that, I think that's the answer is to not approach, and why I talk more and more about a dysregulated nervous system instead of trauma, because people back away from the idea of trauma, even though my books are Trauma in the Pews. The next one is Trauma in the Pews 2.0, Healing as a Spiritual Practice.
That sounds fun.
It does sound good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're interviewing, the next person we're interviewing is going to be somewhat incognito. She's been through a lot, and she has a podcast that focuses on humor, and so in a light way they approach some of these things. But we've also interviewed, say, 30 or 40 people that have come out of high demand religions and things. And one thing that's encouraging, first of all, they're telling their stories, they're getting help. I recommend you get some help. I read that in your book. But also people are just realizing the overwhelming need we have in schools and churches, in all the different places that you talk about in your book, Trauma in the Pews, that I see people kind of rising up and starting to address these things and starting to communicate about them to people. And the seminar I saw you on the other day is an ex-pastor that led that discussion. And so I'm excited that in all areas we're starting to get this. Hopefully.
Starting to get it. And so here's the thing, people said, well, hasn't there ever been trauma? And I'm like, have you read history? Well, obviously there's always been trauma, but many of the ways that we process trauma have been taken away from us. Okay. Like think about Jesus. Was his life term? Yes, he walked everywhere. That's bilateral stimulation. Okay. Going out and chopping wood. I mean, there in my mind, I mean, why do we have axe throwing places now? Because we're trying to get some of that out of us, right? We're sedentary, we sit in front of the Zoom camera, right? We do. And we don't have all of the ways. We don't have the front porches where people walk around the neighborhoods and talk to each other. We don't have, we've become isolated. So a lot of the ways in the past, and especially the indigenous people with the drum beats which are definitely a healing practice. We don't utilize a lot of the ways that we as human species have been able to process trauma out of our bodies in the past.
Yeah. This has been a really good conversation. I'm like kind of sad that it's coming to a close, but first of all, if anyone is out there and you are not following the Attachment and Trauma Network, I would highly, highly recommend that. But Janyne, how can people get in touch with you if they want to know more about your books? How can they get their books? How can they get in touch with you?
So my website is Janyne, JANYNE.org. And you can always contact me through my website. I set up a link tree. I sent you that link, and I went crazy. I have one for my Brave books. I have one for Trauma in the Pews, and I have one for just general. I was just having so much fun with them, but and I'll probably post those up on the front of my website so people can access that. So I said in a seminar one day, I said, just giggle my name. No, I mean Google. and I'll come up and you'll be able to find me. So I'm on social media and just about everywhere. But yeah.
I should see if carl.org is available, but I doubt that it is. A little more common spelling.
Well, I would have gone with Janyne.com, which makes much more sense. When I had this set up, like even before I went to therapy, I set up this website and I just morphed it over the years. But there was a real estate agent who had already taken it. And with my spelling of my name. And then one day about 6 months ago, she found me on LinkedIn and she said, oh my gosh, we have the same name. And I said, yeah, you stole .com from me.
Work some kind of swap there.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad you got to be on the podcast today. It's been a real pleasure. I've been just absorbing everything you've had to say, and I really appreciate your wisdom on this topic, especially trauma in the pews and church harm and church trauma. So thank you for being here today.
I have loved this conversation. I'm like you. I could just sit here for the rest of the evening. We could just chat, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Janyne. For all of you out there listening, we appreciate you tuning in. We do notice when we see downloads and things from the podcast, and we hope that you get as much out of it as we do. I think we've grown a lot over the last few years just by listening to conversations
like this one today.
Yep. So we're thankful that you dropped in. As always, be where you are, be who you are, and be at peace.
Thank you for joining us today on the Desert Sanctuary.
Remember, all that wander in the desert are not lost. We hope that you know
you are seen,
you are heard,
and you are loved.